Okay, the first thing we're going to look at is any vocabulary that you won't know, things that are a bit uncertain. So I'm going to read it and I'm going to highlight the things that I think you might have struggled with. I may be wrong, but we'll have a go. So this is The Pit. It's an extract from Danny Champion of the World by Roald Dahl. I cannot possibly describe to you what it felt like to be standing alone in the pitchy blackness. So the first thing I think is pitchy. Now pitchy refers to a very black tar. So if you think of the stuff that they put on the roads or the stuff that holds the bits of the playground together, that's like pitch. So it's incredibly black. In the pitchy blackness of that silent wood in the small hours of the night. Now small hours is another one, I think. Now small hours refers to those early hours of the morning, you know, the ones, the twos, the threes, the fours, as opposed to the 11s and the 12s, which are sort of at the beginning of the night. So obviously he's out at 2 or 3 in the morning. The sense of loneliness was overwhelming. The silence was as deep as death, and the only sounds were the ones I made myself. I tried to keep absolutely still for as long as possible, to see if I could hear anything at all. I listened and listened. I held my breath and listened again. I had a queer feeling, now in this instance, because this text was written 45 years ago, and by a man who was probably 50 at the time. Queer means strange, so I had a strange feeling that the whole wood was listening with me. The trees and the bushes, the little animals hiding in the undergrowth, and the birds roosting in the branches, all were listening. Even the silence was listening. Silence was listening to silence. I switched on the torch. A brilliant beam of light reached out ahead of me like a long white arm. That was better. Now at any rate I could see where I was going. Now it's only a short piece of text, but it's got a lot going on in it. Okay, the next thing we're going to look for is similes. Now a simile is a phrase that compares something to something else. Okay, like or as. So we go straight through it again. We skim and we scan and we look for it. The silence was as deep as death. So that is a simile. It's saying that the silence is as deep as death. Okay, are there any others? So I skim and scan a little further. Try to keep myself as long as it's possible. A brilliant beam of light reached out ahead of me like a long white arm. Like a long white arm is a simile. It's comparing something to something else. Okay. The next thing we're going to look for is alliteration. Now alliteration is where the onset of the words have the same sound. So big bouncing ball all have that B sound. So we're going to quickly skim and scan and see if we can find any. Silent. Okay. Standing alone in the pitchy blackness of that silent wood in the small hours. The sense of loneliness. Dee-dee. What have we got? Brilliant beam. Well, there's at least one. Okay. Next thing we look for is repetition. Now, often repetition is as a sign that you haven't got the correct words, but in this instance, it's used to make a point. So even the silence was listening. So we've got silence. Silence was listening to silence. So we've got 3 silences there. And we've got 3 lots of listening. All were listening. Even the silence was listening. Silence was listening to silence. So he's made this point 3 times just to try and emphasize just how silent it was. Quieter than quiet. Okay, how old is this text? Well, I've alluded to the fact that the man who wrote it, Roald Dahl, was born in 1919, and this was published 45 years ago. Now, the word that I'm thinking of is this word queer. It has a completely different meaning today to what our grandparents and our great-grandparents knew. So I would look at that word there and I would immediately think that this was a text that was either written a long time ago or set a long time ago. Having read this little bit of text, it's really hard to decide how old the character is, because the language that's being used is quite sophisticated and we've got nothing to compare the character to. Now, knowing that it's a children's book, and most children's books' main characters are children, we could probably argue, using our background knowledge, that it's a child. And knowing that Roald Dahl extensively wrote lots of children's books, we could probably make that conclusion as well. But it's very hard to do it with any, certainly to back it up with any evidence from the text. Okay. Another thing we want to look at is this, a brilliant beam of light. Let's get rid of some of this stuff and see why this piece of text works really well. Okay, a brilliant beam of light. So we've got that alliteration, a brilliant beam of light reached out ahead of me like a long white arm. And it just punctuates. You've got this whole bit, and you've gone from this big bit about it being black and it being silent and it being claustrophobic. Now that means that you're stuck in somewhere quite small and it feels like the sides are pressing in on you, and I would say that that's what this person feels like. The darkness is pressing in and the silence was pressing in. Ooh, I don't know if you can hear that, that's a chicken in the garden. And then suddenly you've got this brilliant beam of light that cuts through it, illuminating the way, showing what's going on.